Well, Erik, I must say that was absolutely fascinating. First of all, I'd like to just extend my own personal welcome to all of you. This is really quite fascinating, but I'd like to just commend AGI and the idea of bringing people like Erik to us in Hong Kong. It really opens up the mind. This idea of GDP that's been completely ingrained in ourselves, and now compared to this idea of consumer surplus, I can't agree more. And you've come up with a new way of actually measuring this because of the new digital age. I'm just wondering, that my first question I would just come to mind is that if you start measuring, how economies are doing based on this new measure, let's say on a global basis, how would you change the world order? Will the rich economies be so much richer, in a sense, and there'll be more discrepancies between the ones that are doing well and the ones that are doing less well? How
That's a great question. I mean, the correct answer is for me to say we don't know until we do the measures, but I'm going to speculate nonetheless.
I'm asking you for speculation.
I'll speculate. First off, I do look forward to doing analogous studies in all the other countries, and we've been partnering with people, so I can give you maybe 1 year from now I can give you a real answer. But my intuition is twofold. First off, most of those free goods, they're available whether you're rich or poor. If you can afford a smartphone, you can get Wikipedia. A person right now with a smartphone probably has more real-time, better information than the President of the United States did 20 years ago on many, many metrics, just by going online and accessing all the information sources. And that could be a child who's 10 years old. It could be a poor person. But there's a but, and that is assuming you have access to this digital infrastructure. And so far, not everybody does. I know that because of the work people are doing in Shenzhen and elsewhere in particular, but around the world, that we're getting much cheaper electronics, and it's becoming available to many more people, billions of people. So for the billions of people who are connected to the internet, I would say it reduces inequality. It raises up some of those, that gives them access to free goods that we aren't measuring. For the people who still aren't connected, it would hurt them. They wouldn't be benefiting the way that people who are connected.
Yeah, no, well, I think that's a great answer. In fact, I couldn't quite decide. I was listening to you, because, well, in fact, the source of all this is because I think in the digital age, the marginal cost of providing more stuff is zero.
Exactly.
Right? And I think it's access to the smartphone.
Right.
That will be the key determinant.
That is one of the biggest ones. But I want to say what you're doing, and another source of value is greater product variety and choice.
Yeah.
So the digital age is giving us these free goods. It's also giving us far more choices of clothing, books, every type of item. The product variety, the SKUs, the number of stock keeping units is skyrocketing.
Right.
And that is in part because these digital inventory systems, global logistics, make it possible to deliver customized or many more choices. That is another thing, by the way, that isn't measured in the GDP statistics, is the value of new goods and choice.
Yep.
And this approach could help. Well,
that's another conversation. We've got to talk about the global supply chain.
Yes.
And how that's evolving.
You know something about that.
No. My next question then is this: if what you say, really following your line of reasoning, if countries begin to adopt this way of measuring, say, well-being in the economy, what does that mean on what I should be doing to enhance my competitiveness?
Yeah.
And where I would make my social and other investments in a country?
It gets back to the point I made at the beginning that if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. And so the people in Washington, D.C. or Beijing or whatever, when they look at the economy and they see the buildings that are going up or the bridges or the tons of steel, they say, we're producing value, GDP is going up. But they should be doing the same thing for the digital economy, the digital payments, the online friends, the access to news and information. Right now, they know it's there. They're not dumb. I mean, everybody knows it's there, but there's no number attached to it. And so I think you will have a implicit or even explicit bias against the digital economy because it isn't being counted alongside, concrete.
It's almost endless, the types of things you can think about, and so on. But I'm glad you've shown that last slide. Remember the value of the toilet.
Yes.
So finally, some things needs to be physical.
I think there's some things that will always, exactly. I don't think we'll be 100% digital, at least not in my lifetime. That would be a very different kind of a
Well,
world.
that's something I'm going to come back to at the end of this. And in fact, some of the new initiatives at MIT, especially the impact of technology on the future of work and so on, which I'd like you to say a little bit about at the end.
Sure.
But at this point, I'd like to just open up now to questions from the audience. I'm sure you guys have burst.
Lots of questions, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I'm Filippo Sebastian. I work in sustainability. My question is about the first statement that you make, and I need to apologize because my knowledge of economics is quite rusty at the moment. I imagine that I do not pay Facebook because when I go on Facebook, I create data that Facebook is then using and selling. Isn't that the value of my time on Facebook? And if you also value my preference as a customer, isn't that double counting in the GDP?
Great question. The answer is no, and let me give you 2 reasons why. First off, in the GDP statistics, so Facebook mainly gets their money from advertising. And advertising is not a final good in GDP, it's an intermediate good. People don't consume advertising for their own pleasure, it's something that helps other companies sell things. And advertising, no matter whether advertising is big or small, it does not add to GDP. So it's not counted as part of GDP. So it's never going to be in there. But there's a more profound, deeper reason, which is that the value to Facebook of the advertising is not very closely related to the value to you of the product. If a company creates a product that creates a lot of consumer surplus, that doesn't necessarily mean that they can charge more to the advertiser. The advertisers care about how many eyeballs they get. So if there's a very small amount of consumer surplus to millions of people, that will generate more advertising revenue than a large amount of consumer surplus to a smaller number of people. So this is something that Michael Spence worked on. We're having breakfast with him, I think. Mike, one of his favorite papers, not as well known, but one of my favorite papers of his, showed that advertising is not correlated with the value that you get from the good. So for both those reasons, we can't just use advertising as a proxy.
Let me think a little bit. As an advertiser, do I care more about a little bit of consumer surplus to a lot of people, or generating more consumer surplus?
You don't care at all about the consumer surplus from the Facebook.
Yeah.
What you care about is how many people view that, how many eyeballs, how many clicks. So one of the points Michael Spence made, if you have advertising-driven content, you will try to make it as viral, to spread as many people. If people afterwards say, that wasn't so great, the advertiser still pays. But if they were charging for it, then it'd be more valuable to have it be they get more return if they had a valuable product. Some people say this is a weakness, or one of the reasons that Facebook and other companies haven't really optimized for consumer value as much as engagement.
Well, thanks, Victor, for putting this on. Fascinating subject. Just a short question. This concept of compatibility, the incentive compatibility, if you have societal values like clean air, clean water, like governance, etc., are these factors that need to be counted as well in the GDP, because they aren't, as we know as of now? And what importance would they have? Because you're now very much focusing on the virtual sort of reality of the IT world.
Thank you for asking that question. It's really important. I didn't have time to get into it. But another weakness of GDP is that it doesn't count, clean air and other things that our economists call externalities. People aren't paying, when they pay for the product, they don't pay for the additional damage they might do to other people in terms of pollution. And ideally, we want to capture those as part of the welfare. This approach could, in principle, go after. We haven't expanded it to that. I don't have any research results to show on that. But we could ask questions about how much people value clean air and clean water and other things. I'd hate to do it incentive compatible and force them to breathe dirty air, but you could get some guesstimates of what people value it. Ultimately, we need to, as you were suggesting, have a broader conception of where we get value in the economy and try to account for it and come up with estimates of all those components. In principle, this method could go after those, and that would be future research.
Well, in fact, Eric, I mean, when you go beyond the monetary side of the old GDP
Yes.
and go into other attributes,
Yes.
you know, you have problems comparing those. What you have is actually a common way to index the
Right.
thing.
This
If you
is-
can actually
exactly.
make it compatible.
I mean, to step even further back, I mean, there are other people who are doing work on things like, what do they call it? You know, the gross national happiness and other, you know, and, you know, it would be interesting to try to get a, we are staying very much within the sort of neoclassical economic framework where we put dollar values, how much would you pay for this versus that? And we get some precision with that, but not as much as you do with GDP. You know, you could imagine a spectrum, you know, GDP where you force people to buy things, you can measure it, our approach where you do these experiments, and then, you know, gross national happiness and other things, you know, what is the meaning of life, and you know, do we need material things at all? Maybe maybe that's a good way to think about the world. I'm not sure. We can't really measure those components. So we're staying with something relatively neoclassical, relatively measurable to enhance what we're doing. But I'm glad that other people are working at these, you know, deeper values and giving us some ideas. I wouldn't put as much precision on those, but
Yep.
one of the things that as our economy gets richer, we need to think about is what do we really value, and what is, you know, what is the ultimate sorts of goals.
Well, in fact, Eric, I think your fantastic approach is absolutely enabled by technology as well, right?
It
Without
is.
these massive surveys,
Right.
you won't be able to have that tool
That's right.
to actually make these measurements. It's unthinkable in the past
Yeah.
to survey 200,000 people in a week or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We'll soon be doing millions of people,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
and with many products, because you know the consumer price index in the United States has about 100,000
Yeah,
different products.
yeah.
So you need to do these things at scale.
I think the whole concept is great, but you are talking about moving from a GDP measure, which measures production, measurable output, and so on, to a measure of consumer surplus, which
Right.
is, you know, a totally different concept. And apart from the fresh water, you know, when we studied economics many years ago, we studied the paradox of, you know, water versus diamond.
Yep.
You know, it's this same issue. But in the, well, we have already had some discussion of that, but a related issue is when you measure GDP, you need to consider how to treat pollution.
Yep.
You know, pollution actually adds to GDP, which is totally wrong.
Right. Exactly. It's
and
backwards.
in this new economy, you are having new pollution problems like fake news, like
Yes. That is a good
so-
kind
That's
of
a good
pollution.
and also you have to consider once you get into the realm of, you know, consumer valuation and surpluses, you know, at the end of the day, all of us have 24 hours a day. You spend more, you know, some of these people just get hooked on Facebook. What have they lost? So
Right.
if you really want to measure the total picture of consumer welfare and surplus, how much time they have lost, you know, going
Yeah.
out to see the wild,
So
know,
this is,
the
I think
fresh
this
air
is,
and all
I'm glad this is another important point. As I spend more time studying this, I realized that there are some sort of profound questions. One of the things when we looked at Facebook, we had positive values, but guess what? There are some people who said, you know, you should include some negative values. That is to say, I will pay you if you take Facebook away from me. Because they feel addicted to it, and they feel, and there are, in fact, one of my postdocs showed me there's an app called Rescue Time that he uses, which does, I'm not hypothetical, it blocks Facebook and other social media. When he has to work on his dissertation, it will, or his research, it will block all the social media. And so you could imagine negative values as well as positive values, which gets to this point about, you know, fake news and social media and other things, that some of these could have negative values as well as positive, just like pollution has negative values. Again, ultimately, we could incorporate some of these, and as we do this work going further, we'll have to incorporate some of them as well. But it does raise some, forces me, and I think all of us, to grapple with some really basic questions about what is the value of any of the goods, and are they positive or negative, and how do we do it? Don't just take the dollar value of GDP and say we're done. You really have to think deeply, what is the value that each of these products creates for some people, for other people, other externalities. But I think that's a feature, not a bug, that we are forced to confront these questions. I think before we were just glossing over these issues, and when you do my methodology with you have no choice but to be explicit about these in a much more clear way.
Thank you, Professor. Welcome to Hong Kong U.
Thank you.
So I quite like your presentation, like your method, but I just want to raise a simple question, small question. So when you ask a question that how much do you want to pay to remain your access to, like, let's say, Wikipedia?
Yes.
That, as we all know, Wikipedia is actually a public goods. It's non-viral, it's non-exclusible. So actually a more sensible question is that how much you will pay to remain the accessibility of all the people around the world to Wikipedia. So that will bring up the question is that under the experimental setting, you ask them, maybe they say $1,000. But if you want to cut off all of the access to all of the people to Wikipedia, they will actually only pay 100 because they want to free ride other people.
Because they want to what?
They want to free ride other people. So my question is whether you, in your understanding, whether this kind of circumstances will occur that people will overestimate the value of the public goods to them. If you want to truly let them pay the money under a real setting, they will actually pay less, not 1,000, maybe 100. Do you think this kind of overestimation will occur under your experiment? Thank you.
So there's different kinds of questions you could ask, and they would give you different values, and you'd have to interpret them appropriately. The question that I showed you, we asked was, if you had no longer had access to Wikipedia, how much would I have to pay you to be willing to give up that? Your friends would still get access, other people would still get access, but you wouldn't get access anymore. I think that's the right value for calculating, what you would be willing to pay. You could ask a different question: what if other people don't get access to it? And we did some a little bit, and then it depends a little bit maybe on how altruistic you are and what you care about the rest of the world, whether or not they will get it. But in our incentive compatible choice, there was no room for free riding. You could not get access to it. We would have to enforce that you didn't get access to it. So there would be no free riding, except sort of in the indirect thing. You could ask your friend a question, I suppose, and then they could go on Wikipedia. But you wouldn't be able to access it yourself.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. My name is Cliff Tan. I work for MUFG, which is a Japanese bank. And as you know, one of the remarkable results in neoclassical economics is that a competitive equilibrium maximizes both the sum of the consumer and producer surpluses. So that got me thinking about these goods that you surveyed, and where it has a zero price. Because your charts can actually help companies decide how to price their product. So then it occurred to me that why are they still pricing it at zero? So I wonder, it's not that Facebook and Google haven't benefited from this kind of an economy. If you look at their market valuations, they're in the hundreds of billions of dollars.
Right.
So it just strikes me, and again, this is the first time I've seen something like this, but it's very interesting, that where it shows up is not income. It shows up in wealth. It shows up in the personal net worth of Mark Zuckerberg. And so, I'm just wondering if we're measuring the right thing. And then the second thing is that you went over it very quickly, but in your table, your survey measure of consumer surplus just fluctuates a lot. I mean, I saw, 2016 to 2017, some of those numbers are like up 10, 15% in a year, which seems very unrealistic if you're thinking about, growth in GDP.
Right. So let me take the second one first. That's a simpler question, is that these are noisy metrics, and we don't have the level of precision. If you look at the error bounds, if you were to measure it in 2016 and then measure it again in 2016, you'd also see them move around by several percent or something. So I wouldn't want to say, and I hope I didn't imply that we knew exactly how much the change was from one year to another. There maybe was some evidence that it was growing, but they were both within the standard errors. So unless we do a much larger scale survey, which we will, to make those standard errors smaller, I can't say for sure whether that's a statistically significant difference. Now, the other question about producer surplus and where the value is going, we focused on consumer surplus mainly because that is where ultimately most of the value ends up. There's work by, so as you suggested, the total welfare gain is the sum of consumer surplus plus producer surplus. That's the total, and potentially additionally externalities. So why don't we also measure producer surplus? Well, there's been work done by Bill Nordhaus and others that in a competitive economy over time, about 97% of the total surplus ends up with consumers. Only 3% over time ends up with producers. And this is what Adam Smith would have wanted, that in a competitive economy over time, producers have to compete with each other and they pass on the benefits. That's why we get our smartphones for so cheap, et cetera. Now, in the short run, they may get some surplus. And so our consumer surplus measure is probably a pretty good rough estimate of the total welfare. It may be missing a little piece of it. The potential bias that I think you also hinted at is if over time producer surplus is becoming a bigger share of the economy relative to consumer surplus, then we will be missing a bigger and bigger share. And there are those who argue, and there's some evidence that in the digital economy, more and more of it has ended up in the hands of some of the Facebook and others. And so maybe we'll start having to add some of the producer surplus as well. But for now, we're just capturing that big chunk there. And that'd be an area for further research.
Okay. Well, I think I'm for short time remaining, I really like to take advantage of, Erik, your visit to really discuss something that I think is quite important for the future. About 3 weeks ago, the president of MIT, Raphael Reif, sent out an email to all the MIT alumni around the world, saying that MIT is going to announce a new effort, which will be a major effort at MIT, to look at the impact of technology on the future of work.
Right.
And I don't want to miss this chance because you're one of the key researchers in that
Right.
and leading the effort at the Institute. Can you talk a little bit about what is behind that?
Yeah.
And where does MIT intend to go with this whole effort? Because I thought a lot about how technology, first of all, has the ability to create new jobs
Right.
through innovation and so on, but without doubt is destroying jobs in the old economy.
Exactly.
Now, the balance, I'm confident it's going to be positive, but there's going to be still, we talked a little bit on the phone last, and there's going to be at least structural unemployment. There's tremendous amount of dislocation
Right.
in the process. And what we really need is a revolution in learning and retraining and so on. So is that the gist of where we go?
I think you said it exactly right. Let me emphasize. First off, I'm very proud that MIT is taking a leadership role in doing this, and Raphael Reif is stepping up because I think it's the grand challenge of our generation, of our era, is that these amazing technologies, and you're familiar with them, and especially in artificial intelligence, but digitization more generally, are having profound effects on the economy, profound effects on work. And there are many new goods and services, some of which I showed you up there that we now have access to. They aren't even being counted. But the other thing we have to bear in mind is not everybody is benefiting evenly. There is no economic law in any textbook anywhere that says that everyone's going to benefit evenly, or even that anyone's going to benefit, period. It's possible for some people to be made worse off by these advances in technology, depending on how they play off. It's even actually mathematically possible, believe it or not, for a majority of people to be made worse off as the pie gets bigger if the wealth becomes much, much more concentrated. Now, I share your general optimism and hopefulness, but and I agree with every word of what you said, except for the one thing I would maybe nuance a little bit is that I don't think this is automatically going to happen to turn out better. That unless we have initiatives like this Future of Work initiative to steer the future, we can't just sit back and hope that it just happens. We have to be active. Everyone in this room has to be active in thinking, what are our values? What kind of a world do we want going forward? How can we use these technologies to create not just prosperity, but prosperity that's aligned with our values, shared prosperity? And I think we can do it. I think we will do it because of these kinds of initiatives. But just as the technology doesn't happen automatically, the work of the future doesn't happen automatically unless researchers, policymakers, entrepreneurs all work, and workers themselves work to retrain, to develop those new skills. And if you look to history, you see that it was never easy. When we transitioned from agriculture to an industrial economy, there were great disruptions. Many people suffered And other people benefited, and eventually, of course, on balance, we were all made much, much better off. But we had to invent new kinds of education. Primary school education was a crazy idea in the 1800s. You're going to send your kids to school to learn reading and writing and arithmetic? What's the use of that on the farm? And later, high school movement forced them to stay in school until they're 16 years old and take them away from the farm. There were many people who thought that was a wacky idea. Of course, now we know that was a smart idea and created not just wealth, but also more broadly shared wealth. There are many other changes like that that we need to make in the 21st century as we transition. And if we do them correctly, I think the next 10 years will be the best 10 years that the planet has ever seen.
Well, I think, really, I think you've really framed the issue that I think is going to be the issue for generation or more. And I hope, Erik, that you'll come back to tell us more about that initiative.
Yeah.
Next time you come through.
Absolutely. No, this is
what MIT is doing.
We're just getting launched on this, although I should say my research in the MIT initiative on the digital economy has been working in this for a while. And of course, the book, The Second Machine Age, Machine Platform Crime, we've touched on some of these issues. So then there are other faculty at MIT and around the world that have been thinking about these. But this, I think, will give it a big impetus. And I will come back and speak about it. Some of my colleagues. And I see here Michael Zhang, one of my students, is here. He's been working with me on some related issues. So I think this is something that's going to be a global effort, and I look forward to having a chance to share it and, more importantly, participate with all of you to address these challenges.
Yep. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've exceeded our time. I'd like to, on behalf of all of you, thank Erik for being with us today.
My pleasure.